The book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, we just read that, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. The name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Verse 4, these took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. As we begin to think about this book of Ruth, which will take our attention for the rest of this month, there was a man sentenced to death who obtained a reprieve by assuring the king that he would, if he gave him a period of time, he would teach his majesty's horse to fly. One condition, he had nothing else to lose, but one condition, if he didn't succeed, he would be put to death at the end of a year. So the other people around him say, why make this deal to make a horse to fly if you're going to die anyway? The guy's an eternal optimist. He said, who knows what will happen in a year? Either the king may die, or I may die, or the horse may die. But who knows? Maybe the horse will learn to fly and it'll all work out in the end. He was willing to take a shot in the dark for 12 months, see if he could do something that no one else has ever been able to do. Friends, for too many of us in this room, hope is little more than suspending the inevitable. When we consider the word hope and what it really is in the way we live, all things end in disappointment or death, but not hope. This is the book of Ruth. This is the story of Naomi. This is how God was working in her life, both to allow her hope to be taken away and later to be restored. But friends, what we discover in chapter 1 is that what hope we do have in this life fades with time. So Ruth is not unlike any one of us. Naomi is not unlike any one of us. At different points in the story, and perhaps even today, we will feel as if the story could have been written about us with our names there and a few of the details different in 21st century language. But that's us. That's how we're dealing with hope. We had hope a long time ago, but in some form or fashion it's begun to fade, or we don't think we have any hope at all anymore. We're out of options, we're low on resources, we're broken and needy, and that's exactly the way many people come to their relationship with the Lord. And that's the challenge of hope, that it fades with time. It's running out. And every one of us is on the clock. This is a story about one particular Judean family. It's a Jewish family from Bethlehem, and we've already been introduced to their names, which we'll see as we go throughout the story. Elimelech's the husband, Naomi is the wife, and they have 2 boys. The nuclear family is much like my own home. I have one brother who's older than I am, so I identify well with the family of 4. But Mahlon and Chilion are the 2 boys. And it's really important to know what's taking place in the cultural and economic and national climate. That this is the time of the judges, and you've had read before you, at least from chapter 2, a little bit of the sense of the disruption and the chaos of the times of the judges from Judges chapter 2. We need to know that Elimelech and Naomi are suffering along, not just in their own home, but with all of Israel. That this is a time of national unrest. That there is tremendous suffering, there are tremendous burdens as a nation. There is death and there is famine and there is struggle for every town. For example, just we're here in Ruth, but look back at the final chapter in Judges, perhaps on the other side of the page. Verse 25, the last verse in Judges, Judges 21:25. It gives us the little refrain that we've heard a couple of times in Judges that we all know so well from the book. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That refrain, that type of we're doing it on our own, that individualism that seems to express itself. And that's why these two books for us in our Old Testament are so closely aligned together, because everything we will learn of the story of the book of Ruth is fit into the time and the economy and the nation of Israel in the time of the Judges. So the book of Judges gives us the national movements of oppression and deliverance. The book of Ruth show us how people lived in their households during that very time. And so when you see that last phrase in verse 25 of Judges 21, everyone did that what was right in his own eyes. When it comes to the home, when it comes to a husband and a wife and two boys, when it comes to Elimelech and Naomi, what they did which was right in their own eyes had less to do about paganism and more to do with survival. They were just trying to live. They were trying to eat. They were trying to make it day to day to sustain themselves. And they were caught in the consequences of national sin because Israel as a nation, as God's people, Israel, forsook the covenant loyalty of God. They had walked away from God. They had walked away from his covenant blessings. They had sinned in taking the Baals and the foreign gods as their gods. And God of heaven was returning to them the judgment that he promised them in the law. He would deliver to them if they disobeyed and if they walked away from his covenant loyalty. For example, Deuteronomy 32, it says very clearly, verses 4 and 5, it says, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are crooked and a twisted generation. Then in verse 24 of Deuteronomy 32, it says this, in God's retribution, among the list of things that he would do in response is verse 24, they shall be wasted with hunger and devoured by plague and poisonous pestilence. So as we look at Ruth in chapter 1, verse 1, and it says to us, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. It is acceptable to look at this as a direct intervention of God as he judges his people for their disloyalty to him, to their paganism as a nation, to their idolatry as a nation. The Lord sends this horrendous famine. And we have to take a moment to recognize and really sense what devastation and what heartache this would bring to the nation and to households. I mean, for us, a famine somewhere else in the world, or even here in the United States, a famine would mean milk goes up by 35 cents a gallon. Well, we might complain about it, but we probably would buy no less milk or bread or some turmoil in the Middle East. Shut down a few oil refineries and it goes back to $4. Well, we see that as a minor disruption of our everyday lives, but not in the Old Testament, not in the land of Judah. The story of Ruth, where it is situated, where it is located, famine means death. Famine means malnutrition. It means opening yourself and your children and your family up to unbelievable diseases that will ravage you. It means tremendous pain, languishing days, and ultimately the inevitable death. Hope was fading for them because of the famine. Why? Because a famine in the days of Ruth and Elimelech and Naomi, a famine was both a natural and an economic disaster in one event. They lived hand to mouth, field to table, in which they would eat exactly what they were given. It's clear that that's how they lived when you read on in the story, and we will in the coming weeks, about how they would get their food for the day and eat in the evening. That's how they lived their lives. It was a 24-hour cycle of eat or die. And so this natural disaster of famine was both a natural and economic disaster, and there would be no hope left for them. So Elimelech, when you see him, and don't prejudge this man for disobedience yet, he is desperately fleeing the land with his family. So I would look at him in his household and say, this husband is doing what he can for his family, for their present need for food. But when we back away from the story, when we look at Ruth in the context of Judges, when we consider this whole story as a meta-narrative, we discover and see that Elimelech is really leading his family away from the land, which is the place of God's covenant blessing. So the story is supposed to speak to us on more than one level. A level of a man who's contending for his household and trying to keep them alive and trying to keep hope alive. At the same time, it's symbolic of what sin does to a nation that turns against God, and particularly God's people Israel, as they have abandoned the covenant loyalty of God. That this is what takes place. The nation is not distinguished from its people, and what the nation did brought God's judgment, which every household would bear. And so Elimelech takes the opportunity. We don't know why. We don't know what he heard, other than there was perhaps some food in the land of Moab. So he takes his family, according to these verses, and he traverses to Moab. It's a 50-mile journey. If you're thinking about a map of Palestine, he is going from Bethlehem, from Judah, and he is making his way around the Dead Sea and over to the opposite side, to the land of Moab. And there he will live for a decade. He will live there for a decade. And during those 10 years, the tragedy of Naomi's life is really laid bare for us. Without detail, without commentary, all we know is Elimelech dies. He dies. And she is left alone. And then we know that later on, after 2 marriages, where there is still a glimmer of hope that the boys can provide, both sons, Mahlon, Chilion, both die. And Naomi is left as a widow with no one to provide for her, with no one to care. Now I want you to notice verse 4. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah and the name of the other Ruth. I don't want you to assume something on the text that would be unfortunate. God is not judging them for marrying foreign wives. You see, the Mosaic law did prohibit Israel from marrying Canaanites, but the law does not extend to Moabites. Ethnically, there was a diversity there, and the law never says that these 2 young men could never take Moabite wives, even though it excluded any Moabite from the assembly of God, according to Deuteronomy 23:3. It excluded them from the assembly of God until the 10th generation, but it never excluded marriage. So don't look at this husband who dies and 2 boys that die and automatically, as some people often do even in our day, look at someone's suffering or someone's death or someone's disease and automatically assume it's the judgment of God. Remember when the disciples did that and the rebuke that they received from Jesus? No, the issue is not ethnicity in marriage. The issue in the time of the judges is spiritual fidelity. It is that their hearts were prostituted to gods that were no longer Jehovah God. That's why his judgment has come. God is not a racist. And as we will soon find out, even in this very story, just in these 4 short chapters that you could go home and after your nap and after your meal, you could sit down and read the entire story so that as you come back in consecutive Sundays, you can be prepared and your heart can be ready for what the Lord is going to lay out before us. But we're going to soon find out that God not only includes a Moabitess in the line of David, he ultimately puts a foreigner, someone of a different ethnicity, in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And friends, it is the same God who welcomes all peoples to come to his name, to come into his family, to come into relationship with him. And so God was not judging these 2 sons or the father or even Naomi for marrying their wives. Here's what the rest of the story brings to us, beginning in verse 6. Then she arose, referring to Naomi, with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the field of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. Verse 7, so she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them. And they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Think about Naomi. Think about her plight. She is not only living with an empty stomach, but she's grieving with an empty heart. Think of the profound emptiness of her life. I wonder how many of you came to church feeling very much the same way, thinking either you have no hope at all or you have little hope that you sense is fading with time. Naomi herself seems to surrender all hope in verses 12 and 13. I mean, there's a reality to this life, isn't it? There are certain things you can do when you're young in age that you can't do when you're old in age. Thank you, Brother Brown, for caring for us so well. There's certain things that after time, when you're a certain age, they fade in the background. They're just wishes or dreams that you let go by. What is Naomi saying about herself? She's saying, listen, even if I could have a husband right now and on this night conceive, even if that was even possible, and the ramification is, no, it wasn't possible. Would you wait for those many years, that delivery, and watch that baby grow up? Well, the absurdity of it is on its face. That there was no hope with Naomi. So she says to her 2 daughters-in-law, which show dramatic love and faithfulness and fidelity. Don't let it be lost upon you that Ruth, being situated in Judges, is showing the way Israel was unfaithful to God, that God was showing 2 Moabite foreigners were more faithful than God's own people. They said, if you stayed with me, I would not be able to bear you sons. Therefore, abandon me because there is no hope and there's no possibility that I will be able to be of any help to you. And it shows us a view of Naomi, that she is destitute in the strictest sense of the word. Note the word left. The little word left, verse 3 and verse 5. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Verse 5, and both the boys die, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. That little word, it means separated from, far from, left in life, yet remaining alive. It is what she is referring to in verse 12 when she said, if I should say I have hope, insinuating that would be wishful thinking. I don't have hope. It's gone. It died with my husband, it died with my boys, and it died with my womb. There is no hope in me. So go away. Friends, I think what we see in this text, what it says to us on this very Sunday morning, is that we ought not overlook the tremendous burden, grief, and loneliness accompanying widowhood. Not just in Naomi's life, but also in Ruth's life, as we will see later on in the story, and Orpah's life as well. This fearful loneliness that because their spouse is gone, that they are all alone, they are left unto themselves, and they have no way of providing for themselves. Brothers and sisters, it is the shared responsibility in our day of both elders and deacons to oversee the souls and the physical cares of our widows. What we ought to be doing in our day in obedience to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 16 is to care well for those who may feel through loneliness and loss that no one else has cared for them. Do you know that's one of the main responsibilities of this church? Is to care for those who God has given to us in widowhood so that they have hope, unlike Naomi and unlike Ruth and unlike her other daughter-in-law, Orpah. Because for them, hope was not only fading, but it seemed as if it was gone with their lengthening age. Now, age does have a sense to take away some of our opportunities. I was reading a book this week. The book was called Reforming Theological Anthropology. I was reading it for a class I'm taking currently by Liron Schultz. It was published in 2002. And I was reading, listen to this. I know it sounds a little convoluted, but you'll get the point after a while. It talks about the passing of an age threshold that makes some things no longer possible. And here's what Schultz says in his book on anthropology. He said, quote, "We cannot overcome the void through the repressive capacities of our ego structures. We can only conceal its widening fissures of nothingness with wallpaper of our psychic busyness." Carl Jung claimed that after the age of 35, all psychological healing is inherently religious. Such healing is not simply religious in content, but involves an existential confrontation of that which is beyond the first three dimensions. This is probably because by this age, most people are beginning to face their inability to conquer the void. The youthful naivety that hopes to stave off death indefinitely is quickly vanishing. Interestingly, the average age of seminarians is now approximately 35. So when I read that, it was, Monday, and I thought, this is of the Lord because our youth pastor, Michael Saunders, turned 35 this past Wednesday. And I thought, I've been looking for a gift for him that was just the right gift. And so I copied and pasted from my Kindle right into an email on Tuesday, right on his birthday. It was Tuesday or Wednesday, I forget. Michael, Tuesday or Wednesday? Thursday. It was this week. So I copied and pasted in, sent it to him, and said, here you go. Here's how good it gets because you just turned 35. Now he is joining me on this naivety of this hopeless void that we're both on now that we're at 35. And I started thinking, at 35, you do feel like some things are passing you by. So I decided, I thought, well, you know what? I wonder if I could go back and join the military at 35. I didn't know the answer to that. I thought maybe I got an MDiv degree, maybe I could be a chaplain. They won't carry me a firearm, but at least I can help people get to heaven before they go. Maybe that's a possibility. So I started doing some research this week, and the answer is no. No, that one's gone. Air Force cut you off at 27, and Army cut you off at 34, and the Marines cut you off at 29, and Navy cut you off at 34. The only hope is the Coast Guard. They let you go to 39. 39, you go to the Coast Guard. But, and I know there's a waiver for everything. I know that. But that time of life is gone. You go into this void, and as you progress through life, the point is you sense that hope is fading. Friends, that's exactly what the story is bearing for us this morning, is that Naomi senses that the hope of her life is fading. It is ultimately gone, and she is just trying to cast other people out of the boat like Orpah and Ruth so she doesn't take them down with her. What do you do for people who feel hopeless? Well, let me give you three applications out of the first part of this story. Things that we have as takeaways. Number one, as hard as it is to hear, emptiness leads to hopelessness. When you're empty, it will ultimately lead you to feeling hopeless. And she's empty, no food, no husband, no sons, no livelihood, no hope. That's why she says in verse 13, "For it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." And so, friends, I also say to you that emptiness will lead you to hopelessness. that without the gospel, you may have food on your table or money in your account, but you are just as empty and hopeless as Naomi. That the God who judged his covenant people with famine will not overlook your sin. And the emptiness of this life is only a pale comparison to the wrathful judgment of God that is justly deserved by sinners. And we are foolish to believe that we can manufacture our own hope. Foolish. Emptiness will lead you to hopelessness. Number 2, the second application is that doing the right thing doesn't necessarily ease the pain. Doing the right thing in your life, that's what many people want religion for. Perhaps you're here thinking, if I just start coming to church more, pray more, perhaps I give, dress up a little bit more, whatever your thought is. If I start being nicer to people and not say ugly things, perhaps it'll get a little bit better for me, perhaps hope will return. I'm here to tell you from the story of Ruth and the life circumstance of Naomi, doing the right thing does not necessarily ease the pain. Because look at what Naomi does right. She does many things right in the story. Verse 2, she follows her husband. We would encourage every Christian wife to follow her husband's leadership and his headship in the home. And that's exactly what she did. Elimelech in verse 2 takes his family and he takes them to Moab, and she follows him, so she does what is right. It didn't lead to greater wealth and prosperity. It actually led to their death. Number 2, verse 6, she recognizes God's hands of provision. What leads her back to Bethlehem? Verse 6 tells us. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the field of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So here's the point. She recognized that it was God's hand of provision to bring food back to the land to end the famine, and she was ready to go back to God's property, God's land, the place of covenant blessing, as soon as the opportunity for food was there. So she does that, and it's right, but doing the right thing is not necessarily easing her pain. Look at verse 8. In verse 8, she shows sacrificial concern for her 2 daughters-in-law. She says to them in verse 8, she says, "May the Lord deal kindly with you." If you want to underline anything in the text, that's the statement you want to underline. When she says, "May the Lord deal kindly with you," she's talking about God's hesed. She's talking about God's covenant loyalty and faithfulness. She's saying, "May the Lord deal as kindly with you as he has shown his covenant loyalty to his people, even though they've denied him." The same covenant loyalty God gives to his people is this kindness, this loyalty. And she's showing to her 2 daughters-in-law that she loves them with the same kindness, and she desires for them the same kindness that God had showed to his people and God had promised to his people. But in all 3 of those things, she did what was right, but Naomi's good works can't bring her boys back from the dead. And friends, the reality is doing the right thing doesn't necessarily ease your pain. And that's not something on this Sunday morning I can promise you. Just do the right thing and everything will work out the right way. Maybe in a world without sin, but not in this one. It may not. And what that says to us when we're thinking about doing the right thing, it's not to ease our pain. It's that we want to be in a position in which we receive God's grace in its freedom. It says to us that God's grace is never merited by reciprocation. It says to us that in this world that is so broken and marred by sin, we are never given God's grace because of how good we are. That's not grace. That's not the grace of the Bible. That's not the grace of God. That's not the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 tell us about that grace that we are given freely. For by grace you have been saved through faith, that it is not of your own doing. It is a gift of God. That grace and that faith is given to you by God and you receive it by him, not because you're good or you're doing the right things, but because God loves you with this hesed, this kindness, this loyalty that was never merited by Israel and will never be merited by you, but God in his kindness gives it to those who will receive his grace. And so we are able to see the gospel in this. We are able to see that grace leads to heaven through Christ. but works lead to hell through you. And I would say, choose grace. I would say, receive grace. I would say, take the grace of God. And for us, that means we look to Christ. It's the recognition that we are sinners, that we are indeed hopeless, as Naomi was hopeless, that we indeed need salvation through the finished work of Christ upon the cross, and we are putting all of our faith upon Him so that our sins were paid for the day He died on the cross, and that His righteousness is given to us, and we will ultimately distribute the Lord's table in just a few moments to revel in and rejoice in and to reflect upon what Christ has done for us and the grace of God that is given to us in His work. And I urge you that doing the right thing doesn't always ease the pain, but God's grace covers all sins. So emptiness leads to hopelessness. Doing the right thing doesn't necessarily ease the pain. But number 3, I think is also powerful to each one of us, and it is this. Your view of God affects your approach to emptiness. How you view God, it will affect your view of emptiness. Because no doubt some of you feel empty and you're tracking towards fading hopefulness. Your view of God, it affects that feeling of emptiness. Here's what I mean. Naomi lost hope because she no longer saw herself as a recipient of God's kindness. Naomi loses hope in chapter 1 because she never again sees herself as a recipient of God's grace. She thought she was abandoned. She thought she was alone. She thought she was cut off. And so after verse 10, Naomi is simply justifying all her own actions. I mean, she says that about her. Look at what she says in verse 13. For it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She's saying, I hope the Lord treats you kindly because surely the Lord isn't treating me with that kindness. Surely He has cut me off. Surely there is no grace left in my life. And so after verse 10, everything she offers, every single thing is a suggested solution that does not involve God. She gives a lot of ways of managing the problem, as we would all do if we were in her case. So first thing, verse 10, go back to your people, because if you stay with me, you're just going to be burdened with my lack of grace, my lack of kindness from God. Turn back. That's why she's saying that to them. Don't go with me. I can't provide for you. She's looking at herself saying, I can't provide children because I don't have a husband. Even if I have a husband tonight, might not get pregnant. And even if I got pregnant and had a baby in 9 months, would you be willing to wait another 18, 22 years until you could have him as a husband? I think not. So she's looking all to herself to justify her own subsistence and her own future. The point is this. Naomi's point is this. She says to her daughters-in-law, it doesn't matter what you believe or who you believe, as long as it satisfies your need for God. And that's the same lie that Satan is propagating through our culture today. Look at what she says. I know we're not there, but look at verse 15. She says to them, see, your daughters-in-law have gone back to her people and to her gods. What does she tell Ruth to do? Return after your sister-in-law. What's she saying? She's saying, listen, any God will do. Any God will do. Any God that will help you kindle hope, that God will do. That was Naomi's line. You see, your view of God affects your approach to emptiness. What we should see that is so wrong in Naomi's heart, what her hopelessness and her emptiness has robbed her, is that we are never the solution to our own problems. We are the creation of our own problems, but we are never the solution to our own problems. 2 Corinthians 12, 8 and 9, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me, Paul writes. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weakness, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. That's what a Christian says with their emptiness and with their hopelessness. They said, I prayed to the Lord about it, and even if he said no, I know God's grace is there to make it bearable, to make it tolerable, to give me the sufficiency that I know is not in me. Naomi's view of God, any God will do, affected her approach to emptiness. And friends, your view of God will affect your approach to emptiness. If you are looking to anything else, including yourself, other than the Lord God of heaven, you will not have what you need for hopelessness and for emptiness. Just because following God looks hopeless doesn't mean it is hopeless. Doesn't mean it is hopeless. And so we end right there in verse 14. We end right there where she's able, with her own philosophical worldview, to convince one daughter-in-law to go back home. There is something about this Ruth in verse 14 who clings to her, who clings to Naomi. That this is the last little thread, the last attachment of God's kindness to Naomi is in the person and the presence of this widow Ruth, who will ultimately lead Naomi back to God's kindness. Let's pray together.